Hello, I'm Teresa Piacentini, and welcome to this lecture recording on theorising the hostile environment. And this will be a recording in two parts. The first part will be looking at understanding the hostile environment and then how we might theorise around it. The second part will be looking at how we apply it to the context of asylum and also resisting the hostile environment. So let's begin with trying to work out what we mean when we talk about the hostile environment. And what is it? So its origins can be found or located to a 2012 newspaper interview with Theresa May of the UK government at the time. And in a newspaper interview, she claimed that foreign nationals believe that they can, quote, come here and overstay because they're able to access everything they need. And so the hostile environment became, initially, it was more of a pledge rather than a policy in and of itself. And so it was difficult to pin down. Unlike most other major policy reforms, there was no white paper that presaged its introduction. There is no central policy document, no official definition, nor clear aims and objectives. The policies are spread across various immigration acts and rules and regulations and affect numerous sectors and policy arenas. The term is also shifting, so it has expanded in academic and media discourse to refer to a general stance of nastiness towards particular migrants. And there's a bit of linguistic slippage there that I think is important to be attentive to when we use the term the hostile environment. But one thing it did do was mark a step change expansion of everyday borders that is unprecedented in the UK in its scale, scope, and speed. So, why was it introduced? To discourage people from coming to the UK, to stop those who do come from overstaying, and also to stop so called irregular migrants from being able to access the essentials of an ordinary everyday life. And it was implemented via the diffusion of borders into everyday spaces. So taking enforcement away from the state and into and the hands of trained state officials, and into the under the responsibility of what Griffiths and Yeo call deputisation of immigration control to the everyday context. So a framework of citizen on citizen papers, please checks. And this has been a more slow-paced development in the UK, but one nonetheless that has been underway for quite some time. And so different actors are responsible for enacting and interpreting immigration policy on the ground. The Immigration Act 2014 was fortified and extended by the Immigration Act 2016, and it is these two acts that make the wide range of third parties, of employers, bank employees, marriage registrars, the driver and vehicle licensing agency, landlords, educational institutions responsible for conducting immigration status checks and consequently refusing people jobs, services, homes, and sharing migrant data with the Home Office. And so these acts work harder than most in curbing the so-called threat of the other in the everyday context. And through an austerity lens, these measures seem rational, needed, common sense even. So borders are no longer where they used to be, and these tactics mark a border control creep into the everyday. And there are some precursors that date back to the 80s around checks on access to services in the health service, for example. But what is new is this creation of the shift from the uncomfortable to the explicitly hostile environment and the shift on internal bordering and deputisation. So the hostile environment extends immigration control beyond the obvious national borders in different areas. And we can look at this in three particular ways around information. Many of the new measures involve ramping up data collection and data sharing between the Home Office and its partners. And this can involve gathering personal data on migrants from other government departments, from NGOs, or from private for-profit companies. So intelligence systems rely on low-grade tip-offs from members of the public, and access to the personal details collected by banks and schools and doctors, homelessness charities, is a big boost to the Home Office's ability to track and arrest so-called illegals. Now, while migrants are currently on the front line of this growing surveillance state, these tools can also be turned against many more people. Secondly, it is operationalised through criminalisation. So the mere effort of trying to live without the correct documents is becoming a crime. Working or driving a car, renting a home to somebody considered illegal can now lead to prison sentences and other harsh penalties. For example, automatic evictions, freezing of bank accounts. It can also hit people with a right to remain. And thirdly, collaboration. So control is outsourced from the Home Office to other government agencies or private bodies. And this way of understanding how it comes to be operationalised demonstrates, I think, the forms of institutional violences that the hostile environment approach produces, but also importantly in ways in which it is racialised, classed and gendered. And I've just put up here 3 different operations that you can draw on as examples of this. Operation Vacan. This is the infamous Go Home vans in the UK that was developed to test the hypothesis that people without leave to remain would depart voluntarily. This pilot took place in ethnically diverse London boroughs, and it included communication techniques such as the display boards on the vans, mobile billboards, postcards in shop windows, adverts in minority ethnic newspapers, leaflets, posters, and advertising in immigration surgeries and faith and charity group buildings. Operation Nexus focused on close working and so-called smarter use of police and immigration interventions. So a case for deportation could be built upon a person's police profile rather than a criminal conviction. And deportation could be justified through a medley of police encounters and arrests, even if these were simply cautionable offences, or if they were made in error, or indeed if they did not lead to any charges. Now, the brunt of this is borne by ethnic minorities, as well as some marginalised white groups, such as East Europeans and Roma. And under this operation, Polish and Romanian police officers were seconded to London to target nationals for removal. The destitution policies also largely focused on rough sleeping Europeans. And Operation Skybreaker presented a new way of work. So the Home Office wanted to engage with local communities and sought to penetrate local faith organisations, holding outreach surgeries with the intention of asking faith organisations to report people with immigration problems through data sharing. And this had the effect of closing down opportunities for people who do have concerns to feel safe. And so these operations show us how immigration controls through the hostile environment, so breaking through this state-led border to the everyday border, pervade increasingly the social arrangements around us. And there is, of course, the hostile environment does harm for people who have lawful immigration status, as well as people who are British citizens. The human impact is wide-ranging and can be extreme, as exemplified in the Windrush scandal. So long-standing lawful residents were brought into the immigration gaze through the hostile environment. These cases illuminated the human repercussions of the system's flaws, particularly the false assumption that lawful residents have documentary evidence, and it also exposed the racialised and classed biases encouraged by selective checks and high sanctions facing those deputised. Many people were left destitute, they lost their homes and jobs, some died prematurely, others were forced to leave the UK for countries they had left decades previously. And of course, there's an impact for people who are more recently arrived, who do not have the socialisation and the culturalisation and the emergency support networks of long-term residents. They too are subject to reduced income through loss or denial of employment. This triggers a cascade of serious problems around accommodation, leading to street homelessness, where they are also vulnerable of being referred to the Home Office, increased dependency, the engagement in irregular work as a result, and the lack of rights that creates a super exploitable workforce. The fatal flaw at the heart of the hostile environment is the conflation of being undocumented and unlawfully resident. And it's assumed that those who have legal immigration status will have documentary evidence, so that a lack of papers equates to a lack of immigration status. However, these populations may overlap, but they are not synonymous. Many lawful migrants do not possess documentary proof of their identity or immigration status, or might only have expired documents. And millions of British citizens do not have passports. So, with Britons who have been refused or failed to prove their nationality to employers being fired under these policies, some are applying for passports simply in order to live and work in their own country. There are societal costs, of course, as well. In addition to these individual impacts, it creates an underclass of illegalised people unable to engage with basic or emergency services. Public health comes under threat when people are afraid or prohibited from accessing medical treatment, vaccinations, antenatal care. There's a risk to police community relations that creates barriers for witnesses and victims to report crimes. And it also weakens government accountability and responsibility by shifting the heavy burden of enforcing refusals and restrictions. It also impacts society by legitimising and encouraging racism and xenophobia, and concerns over potential discrimination against anyone who's so-called foreign-looking or appearing to be immigrants. These concerns have been raised by NGOs and lawyers. The Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants called the 2013 Immigration Bill a travesty that would divide society. And the Immigration Law Practitioners Association, ILPA, warned it would be intrusive, ineffective, and likely racist and unlawful. Shelter, the homelessness organisation, found in a poll that 44% of landlords would not rent to people who appear to be immigrants. And another NGO found that JCWI found that half of landlords report being less likely to rent to foreign nationals, and 58 refusing ethnic minorities without British passports. The risk of institutional discrimination translating into uneven immigration enforcement is particularly high with the police. And the hostile environment not only legitimises and encourages discrimination by those to whom it deputises, but is an ongoing expression of the colonial system of racial ordering. And it's important to remember that the dire impacts are not accidental, but central to its operation. Indeed, the effectiveness of everyday bordering is a production of generalised feelings of instability and anxiety, which creates chronically insecure, dehumanised, deportable people. So how might we theorise the hostile environment? And I'm going to begin here with, again, reiterating that the UK is caught between a desire to embrace flows of mobility for economic advantage and control and order such flows even more minutely. So we witness the production of what Walters calls the logic of domopolitics. Domopolitics is a useful concept to think about xenophobia. It refers to an ideology that sees the state as home, thereby setting up an opposition between the domestic and the international. The state as home means a closed, secure space with guests by invitation only, doors locked at night. And the heads of state are similar to traditional patriarchal father figures, running the state as if it were a household. In the present context of the EU crisis, the metaphor of the home is immoral and emotive in many interconnected ways. And it works as a metaphor to mark out nationality, citizenship, and belonging. It also has a second articulation, one where incomers have to be filtered, screened, controlled, and domesticated. And this is rationalised as a series of necessary security measures in the name of a particular conception of home. And security to sanction exceptional measures is seen as proportionate and rational. And we can look at some examples here of the Golden Visa Scheme, which is the global talent visa scheme in the UK for talented and promising individuals. So this is a way of filtering. But we can also see it through refugee quota schemes, most recently in the Afghan Citizen Resettlement Scheme. These programmes, and they have a history in the UK from the 70s, are about filtering, selection and identification of those seen to be acceptable. So we could read that as genuine or deserving or orderly or certain or invited. They are presented as the safe and positive outcome of a domopolitical system of decision making. screened and checked, and have a legitimate route to the UK. And this can be compared to the more complex, and we could read that as disorderly, chaotic, uncertain, or uninvited issues associated with people who claim asylum of their own volition. So the legal route for genuinely deserving cases goes hand in hand with tough action taken to stop the so-called abuse of a system by those who are not understood as genuine refugees. The idea of the home, I think, is powerful because its familiarity and ordinariness gives it a powerful moral and emotional appeal. And it has a particular salience in the context of austerity in terms of an acceptance of the necessity of cuts, of managing migration and mobility, and marking out who deserves the scarce and shrinking resources of the welfare state. Who needs to be prioritised, who is seen as a burden, and then poverty comes to be outsourced to migrants. We can also think, well, domopolitics provides a way into theorising bordering, and necropolitics provides a way to address the historical legacies of racism and results in concepts that are applicable to understanding insecure immigration status and illegality as legal exclusions to citizenship only. So, as an extension of who may or may not come in the context of colonialism, sovereignty means the capacity to define who matters and who does not, who is disposable and who is not. Necropolitics then offers an understanding of sovereignty as an expression of past and present colonial governance that has the power and capacity to dictate who may live and who may die. For Mbembe, racial exclusion is central to necropower, described as death worlds, where social existence is dependent on bodies that matter and those who do not. Race is the ever-present shadow in Western political thought and practice, and the politics of race is ultimately linked to the politics of death, with legacies of racism and colonialism. And this is imperative to comprehending how a racialised immigration system renders certain bodies illegal. And we've already looked at that in relation to the histories of colonisation, migration and racism, and that law and policy can be seen as an extension of colonial borders that render the racialised poor susceptible to harm and premature death. And in terms of understanding how the UK immigration becomes illegalised and racialised as necropolitical, again, Windrush offers a sharp example to demonstrate how the power dynamics of racism and colonialism intertwine and certain bodies become susceptible to death worlds as illegalised bodies. Media attention documented that those who came to the UK from former colonies as UK citizens found themselves entangled with the government's hostile environment agenda, and this resulted in many subject to deportation, detention, and able to access services. Their racialised bodies were rendered illegal and unworthy of protection. And in the post-colonial world, necropolitics can be aptly applied to Europe's contemporary migrant camps and the UK asylum policy, and people who are trying to survive it, in many cases being kept alive but in a state of injury. The outcome of this then is a form of slow violence that occurs gradually and out of sight. Natalia Farmer also does really important work on people who are no recourse to public funds, and we'll be looking at some of that in the class. So, taking us through this journey of theorising the hostile environment, slow violence, as Nixon explains, is one that occurs out of sight. It has an attritional nature, and it provokes us to expand our imaginations of what constitutes harm, and makes us take seriously forms of violence that have over time become unmoored from their original causes. So similarly to necropolitics, it forces us to look beyond the immediate and the obvious in our explorations of social injustice. We have to look at gradual death and destruction and social brutality, but we have to delve into the past to understand the violent structures of inequality that come to shape and inform contemporary life. So conceptually, it is extremely valuable, I think, to help us make sense of the attritional nature that lies in the wake of the devastation that lies in the wake of the asylum process. But not just in the UK, and we can apply this to other contexts, for example, US immigration detention and Australian offshore detention. So we can contrast fast violence as potentially, though not necessarily, more visible. It may include dawn raids, border violence, deportation, whereas slow violence may be hardly legible, a single perpetrator may be hard to identify. But as Rob Nixon explains, and Mablin picks this up, as do Mablin, Joaquin Kazemi, it is no less deadly. Indeed, impoverishment, as we'll go on to see around how the hostile environment is applied to people in the asylum process, impoverishment of slow violence gradually degrades bodies and minds quietly, behind closed doors, making it invisible to the majority of the population. And this idea gives it a bit of a camouflaging characteristic. This can be socially concealed and ingrained and institutionalized beyond recognition. But I think we also need to ask a question here about when we talk about it being out of sight, we think of out of sight to whom? It is not out of sight to the people who are directly affected by it. It is not out of sight to the people who are struggling to live with the daily effects of it. So, whilst we can contrast the out of sightedness and spectacular nature of slow violence with the spectacle of the border, for example, I think we also need to shift our questioning to refocusing on out of sight to whom. And I think in that way we become more attentive to alternative perspectives and knowledge claims in bordered and hostile spaces. And we'll be going on to look at that in the second part of this lecture.